Federal Reserve Vice Chair for Supervision. Michelle Bowman delivered a speech in January 2026 that contained a sentence most Americans never heard. She said although initial claims for unemployment insurance have remained low, there are signs that layoffs may have increased as challenger private job cut announcements have reached their highest 12-month level since 2010, outside of the pandemic. Read that again. The highest 12-month level of job cut announcements since 2010. And she said we could see layoffs rise quickly since job openings have softened and hiring rates are already low. And she said the share of long-term unemployed workers reached 26% in December, the highest since early 2022, reflecting a less dynamic, low-hiring, low-firing labor market. And Fed Chair Jerome Powell himself stated that he believes payroll employment growth has been overstated and that revised data will show the U.S. has been losing jobs since April 2025. Not gaining, losing. And Stanford's Institute for Economic Policy Research confirmed that average monthly employment growth has been just 17,000 since April, a level that historically would signal a labor market in crisis. And a Medium analysis called it the silent crash, documenting that professional and business services, the white-collar backbone of the modern economy, have stagnated or lost jobs, reflecting layoffs in tech, consulting, media, and other high-pay segments. And they said when sentiment detaches from reality, the adjustment is rarely gentle. That is what this video is about. The quiet collapse. The one that is happening right now beneath the surface, in the spaces between the headlines, inside the household budgets that nobody is tracking, behind the closed doors of families that are running out of room. It has not reached you yet. Or maybe it has and you have not named it yet. But it is coming. And by the time the headline catches up to the reality, the damage will already be done. So I am going to describe the collapse as it is actually happening. Not the version you see on television. The version that is unfolding inside American households right now. The version that begins with a feeling you cannot quite name, a tightening in the budget that was not there 6 months ago, a calculation at the grocery store that you never used to make, a pause before you swiped the credit card that did not used to exist, a conversation with your spouse that starts with the words, "I do not think we can afford that anymore." That is the quiet collapse. It does not announce itself. It arrives as an absence. The absence of the margin that used to exist between what you earn and what you spend. The absence of the cushion that used to sit between a bad month and a financial crisis. The absence of the confidence that used to accompany the belief that next year would be better than this one. And once you see it, once you name it, once you understand that it is not just you, that it is 70% of American households experiencing the same absence at the same time, you cannot unsee it. And you should not unsee it, because seeing it clearly is the first step to surviving it. The labor market is not slowing down. It is quietly dying, and the death is hidden by statistics that no longer measure what they used to measure. The unemployment rate is 4.3%. That number sounds manageable. It is within the range that economists call full employment. And if you stop there, if you look only at that number, the economy looks fine. But the unemployment rate does not count the people who stopped looking for work. It does not count the 55-year-old who applied for 300 jobs and received 4 interviews and 0 offers and eventually stopped applying because the rejection became unbearable. It does not count the freelancer whose clients reduced their budgets by 40% and who is technically employed but earning half of what they earned in 2023. It does not count the worker whose hours were cut from 40 to 28, who is still classified as employed even though their income dropped below the poverty line. And the real measure of labor market health is not the unemployment rate. It is the hiring rate, and the hiring rate has collapsed. Private payroll gains averaged only about 30,000 per month in the fourth quarter of 2025, with job gains more than accounted for by healthcare and social services alone, suggesting that labor demand has continued to gradually soften, and KPMG described it as jobless growth, noting that employment slowed to the weakest pace since 2020, and it was the second worst year for job gains since the global financial crisis in 2009. And consumer confidence dropped to recession levels in December, and concern about both inflation and the labor market moved up in tandem for the first time since the 1970s. The last time Americans were simultaneously worried about inflation and unemployment at this level was during the stagflation era that produced a decade of economic misery. And the fulcrum noted that a quiet but meaningful shift is underway beneath the surface and that policymakers, economists, and investors have shifted their focus from inflation to affordability. And the tax refund wave that is boosting Q1 spending will wear off by late spring or early summer. Analysts expect unusually large refunds due to the OBBBA withholding changes. But research shows that households treat refunds like windfall gains and spend them quickly. And with card balances elevated, auto and rent payments squeezing budgets, and delinquencies rising, a large share of refunds will go toward catching up on bills rather than new spending. Once the lump sum is spent, income reverts to its prior trend. And if the labor market is weakening and real wages are flat, the underlying strain will resurface by late spring or early summer. The tax refund is not a recovery. It is a sugar high, and the crash that follows a sugar high is worse than the baseline because the household briefly felt relief and then lost it. That psychological whiplash from temporary relief back to grinding pressure is what produces the despair that shows up in the data 3 months later as a missed credit card payment, a skipped insurance premium, a withdrawal from the 401k hardship fund. And I want to put a human face on the labor market fragility because the numbers obscure the experience. Imagine a 47-year-old web developer in Lawrence, Kansas named Jeremy Tolbert, who told CBS News that with his family's monthly health care premiums set to rise 18% to $2,600, they are cutting their food budget. Not talking about beans and rice, he said, but going from a comfortable middle-class lifestyle to eating how they did when they first got out of college. He is employed, he has a household income that would place him in the middle class by every statistical measure, and he is cutting his food budget because his health care premium alone consumes a larger share of his income every month. And a 61-year-old former research scientist named Manuel Lubinas, who had to retire due to a neurodegenerative disease, told Bloomberg that he and his wife are digging into their savings to cover rising insurance costs. "We just have to manage week by week and see what happens," he said. Week by week, not year by year. Not planning for the future, surviving the present. And these are not outliers. CBS News polling found that 7 in 10 Americans, 70%, said they were struggling to pay for food, housing, and health care. 7 in 10. That is the quiet collapse. Not a recession in the traditional sense, not mass layoffs that show up on the evening news. A slow, grinding erosion of household viability that is happening to the majority of the country while the headline statistics say the economy is growing. The child care system is on the verge of collapse, and when it goes down, it will take millions of working parents with it. KPMG identified a risk that almost nobody is talking about. A freezing of federal child care funding poses new risks because many child care facilities rely on those funds and will close if the funds are allowed to lapse. And they documented that child care disruptions have risen over 20% since before the pandemic. And Care.com reported that daycare costs have surged 39% since 2019. And 7 in 10 Americans now say raising a child is unaffordable, up from 58% just 1 year ago. And a 42-year-old mother in New York told CBS News that she pays $450 per week for daycare, which is $1,800 per month more than most Americans pay in rent. And the child care system is not a luxury. It is the infrastructure that makes the two-income household possible. When a child care center closes because its funding was cut or its costs exceeded its revenue, the parents who depended on that center do not find a replacement the next day. They find themselves in a child care desert, a geographic area where there are more than 3 children for every licensed child care slot. And the USDA found that more than half of all Americans live in a child care desert. And when a parent cannot find child care, one of them stops working. Almost always the mother. And when the mother stops working, the household income drops by 30 to 50%, depending on the family's income structure. And the family that was managing on 2 incomes is suddenly not managing on 1. And the mortgage payment that required 2 paychecks is now being funded by 1. And the bills that were tight with 2 incomes become impossible with 1. And the credit card fills the gap at 22.76%, and the compound interest on the gap spending accumulates every month until the family is so deep in debt that recovery takes years, not months. And all of it was triggered by a single child care center closing. That is the quiet collapse. It does not happen on Wall Street, it happens on your street. In the house next door where the family with 2 kids and 2 working parents just discovered that their daycare is closing at the end of the month and the wait list at every other facility in the area is 6 months long and the math no longer works. And the quiet part, the part that nobody sees, is the conversation at 11 p.m. where one parent tells the other that they are going to have to quit their job. And the career they built and the income they earned and the retirement they were funding ends. Not because they chose to stop working, because the infrastructure that made their work possible was defunded, and the scale of this quiet catastrophe is staggering when you look at the numbers. There are approximately 12 million children under age 5 in the United States who require childcare. The existing system was already insufficient before the pandemic, operating on margins so thin that a 10% decline in enrollment could close a center. And now, post-pandemic, with 39% higher costs since 2019, with federal funding at risk, with staff shortages because childcare workers earn a median of $14.60 per hour, less than most retail employees, the system is not just insufficient. It is collapsing. New Mexico became the first state to offer universal no-cost childcare funded by its land-grant permanent fund, saving families an average of $12,000 per year. But New Mexico is one state with oil revenue to fund the program. The other 49 states are watching their childcare infrastructure disintegrate while their state budgets are being squeezed by the federal Medicaid cuts, reduced tax revenue from a slowing economy, and increased demand for services from families that are falling out of the middle class. And every child care center that closes increases the burden on the centers that remain, which raises their wait lists, which increases the number of parents who cannot find care, which increases the number of parents who stop working, which reduces household income, which reduces consumer spending, which weakens the economy further. Another feedback loop. Quiet, invisible, devastating. The small businesses that hold your community together are closing at a rate nobody is tracking because nobody is looking. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget described what a fiscal crisis could look like, and they used a phrase that should chill every small business owner in America. They said it could spark a wave of defaults, rising unemployment, business failures, and foreclosures, and the conditions for that wave are building quietly. Small businesses operate on margins of 2 to 7%. That means for every $100 of revenue, the business keeps $2 to $7 in profit. And when the costs that the business cannot control increase simultaneously, insurance premiums up 30 to 60%, electric bills up 30%, gas up 67%, inventory costs up 12 to 18% from tariffs and food inflation, minimum wage increases in 19 states, health insurance costs for employees up 7%. The margin is consumed. And a business operating on a 4% margin that absorbs a 5% increase in aggregate costs is no longer profitable. It is subsidizing its own existence by drawing down savings, deferring maintenance, cutting employee hours, or borrowing against a line of credit. And when the line of credit is exhausted, the business closes. And when it closes, the employees lose their jobs. And the customers lose their services. And the community loses the tax revenue. And the landlord loses the tenant. And the commercial property that housed the business sits vacant, which reduces the assessed value of the surrounding properties, which reduces the property tax revenue for the municipality, which reduces the budget for schools and roads and fire departments and the other public services that the community depends on. One small business closing is an event. 10 small businesses closing on the same commercial strip is a collapse. And the collapse is happening right now in communities across America where the combination of elevated costs, reduced consumer spending, labor shortages from immigration enforcement, and rising credit costs has pushed marginal businesses past the point of viability. And nobody is tracking it because small business closures are not reported to any central database. The Bureau of Labor Statistics tracks establishment births and deaths, but the data is released with a lag of 12 to 18 months. By the time the data confirms what happened, the businesses are gone and the communities they served have been permanently altered. The data is a rear-view mirror, and the quiet collapse is happening in real time through the windshield. And there is a dimension to small business closures that the economic data does not capture but that every community feels. The restaurant that has been open for 22 years, where you celebrated anniversaries and birthdays, that closes because the insurance tripled and the food costs surged and the landlord raised the rent, and the owner, who is 61 years old and has been working 14-hour days for 2 decades, simply cannot absorb another cost increase. The hardware store that employed 5 people from the neighborhood, that sponsored the Little League team, that extended credit to families during hard times, that closes because the customers who used to spend $200 per visit are now spending $120 because their household budget has been consumed by healthcare and gas and groceries and utilities. The child care center that served 45 families, that employed 12 workers, that closes because federal funding was frozen and the tuition increases needed to cover costs would have pushed out the families that needed the center the most. Each one of those closures is a community institution gone, and the community is diminished by each one. Not financially, although the financial impact is real. Emotionally, structurally, in the web of relationships and mutual dependence that makes a neighborhood a community rather than a collection of addresses. The quiet collapse is not just an economic event. It is a social dissolution. And the social dissolution is harder to repair than the economic damage because you can recapitalize a business, but you cannot recapitalize trust and belonging and the feeling that the street you live on is a place where people take care of each other. The collapse is coming for you because the systems you depend on are connected, and when one fails, the others follow. And here is the part that most Americans have not yet understood and that I need you to internalize before this video ends. The quiet collapse is not a collection of separate problems. It is a single interconnected system that is failing. The labor market weakness reduces household income. Reduced household income reduces consumer spending. Reduced consumer spending pushes small businesses past their margin. Small business closures eliminate jobs, which further reduces household income, which further reduces consumer spending, which pushes more businesses past their margin. That is the first feedback loop. And it feeds into the second. Reduced income increases reliance on credit cards at 22.76%. The interest payments consume a growing share of income. The growing share consumed by interest reduces the income available for spending. The reduced spending weakens more businesses. That is the second feedback loop, and both feed into the third. Reduced income and increased debt lead to missed mortgage payments. Missed mortgage payments lead to foreclosure proceedings. Foreclosures reduce home values in the neighborhood. Reduced home values reduce the equity of every homeowner on the street, even the ones who are current on their payments. And reduced equity means reduced ability to borrow, reduced ability to sell at a gain, and reduced net worth that affects every financial decision the household makes. That is the third feedback loop. And all three are connected. The labor market weakness that started quietly in April 2025, the credit card debt that crossed $1.21 trillion, the foreclosure filings that have risen for 12 consecutive months, the small business closures that nobody is counting, the child care centers that are closing because their funding was cut, they are not separate stories. They are the same story, told in different voices, in different communities, to different families, but connected by the same underlying truth. The economy that is supposed to support American households is withdrawing its support, one system at a time, and the households that depend on all of those systems simultaneously are discovering that when one fails, the others cannot compensate. The child care center closes and the parent stops working and the income drops and the credit card fills the gap and the interest compounds and the mortgage is missed and the foreclosure begins. One failure, 6 consequences. Connected by the reality that a household is not a portfolio of independent investments. It is a single, fragile, interconnected system that depends on every piece working at once. And right now, the pieces are failing. Quietly, one at a time, in a sequence that is building toward a moment when the failures are no longer quiet. And I need to explain why this collapse, which you may believe is happening to other people in other communities, is coming for you. Because that is what the title of this video promises, and I intend to deliver on it. If you are employed, the labor market fragility means your job is less secure than you think. Challenger job cut announcements are at their highest 12-month level since 2010. Your employer may not have announced layoffs yet, But the companies that supply your employer, that purchase from your employer, that partner with your employer are making decisions right now that will affect your employer's revenue in 90 days. And reduced revenue leads to reduced headcount. And the hiring rate is so low that if you lose your position, the average time to find replacement employment is longer than at any point since the pandemic. If you are a homeowner, the foreclosure filings rising for 12 consecutive months mean that your neighborhood's stability is less certain than you think. FHA delinquencies at 11.52% mean that the neighbor who bought with 3.5% down and a debt-to-income ratio above 45% may be struggling to make payments. And if they default and the home goes to foreclosure, the sale price sets a comparable that reduces the appraised value of your home. Your equity declines because of someone else's default. If you are a parent, the childcare disruption rising 20% means the center you depend on is under financial stress you cannot see. And if it closes, your ability to work, your ability to earn, your ability to fund the life you have built, disappears with it. The quiet collapse does not ask permission to enter your life. It arrives through a letter from your employer, a notice from your childcare center, a foreclosure sign on the house next door, a credit card statement that shows a balance you cannot believe accumulated this fast. And by the time it arrives, the window to prepare has passed. What you can do right now before the quiet collapse reaches your door. I have described the collapse. Now let me describe the defense, because you are not powerless. You are the person standing between the collapse and your family, and the defense starts with seeing what is coming before it arrives. First, assess your household's vulnerability to job loss right now. Not when the layoff notice comes. Now. How many months of expenses could you cover if one income disappeared tomorrow? If the answer is less than 3 months, you are vulnerable, and every week that passes without building that reserve is a week of increased risk. Start today. Cancel subscriptions, defer purchases, redirect every available dollar toward a cash reserve that sits in a high-yield savings account earning 4% instead of a big bank account earning 0.01%. Second, if you depend on childcare, identify your backup now. Know the wait lists, know the alternatives, know the family members or neighbors who could provide emergency care if your childcare center closes. Because the closure will not give you 90 days notice. It will give you 30. And by the time you start looking, every other parent whose center closed is looking at the same time. The early movers get the spots. The late movers lose their income. Third, if you own a small business, do your margin math today. Add up every cost increase since January 2024 as a percentage of revenue. Insurance, utilities, inventory, labor. If your aggregate costs have increased more than your aggregate revenue, you are subsidizing your business and the subsidy has an expiration date. The businesses that survive the quiet collapse are the ones that adjust before the margin disappears, not after. Fourth, pay down your highest interest debt before the summer cost surge arrives. Every dollar of credit card balance at 22.76% is a dollar working against you 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Reducing that balance is the highest guaranteed return available to any American household right now. Fifth, have the conversation, the one you have been avoiding, with your spouse, your partner, your family. What happens if the income drops? What happens if the child care closes? What happens if the business struggles? What do we cut? What do we protect? What is our plan? Because the families that come through a quiet collapse are not the families that were lucky. They are the families that were honest with each other before the collapse reached them. And honesty is the one preparation that costs nothing and protects everything. I want to close with something personal. I make these videos because I believe that clarity is the most valuable thing you can give someone in a time of confusion. And right now, the confusion is everywhere. The stock market says the economy is fine. The unemployment rate says the economy is fine. The GDP says the economy is fine. And 7 in 10 Americans say they are struggling to pay for food, housing, and health care. And a Federal Reserve vice chair says the labor market is fragile. And consumer confidence is at recession levels, and credit card delinquencies are at a decade high, and child care disruptions are up 20%, and small businesses are closing on every commercial strip in America. Both things cannot be true. The economy cannot be fine, and 7 in 10 Americans cannot be struggling at the same time. One of those is a measurement. The other is a lived experience. And I trust the lived experience. I trust the family that tells me they cannot afford their groceries. I trust the parent who tells me their daycare closed. I trust the 58-year-old who tells me they have applied for 300 jobs and received 0 offers. I trust the small business owner who tells me their margin disappeared. And I trust you, the person watching this video right now, who clicked on it because something in the title resonated with something you are feeling but have not been able to name. The quiet collapse. That is the name. And now that you have the name, you have the power to see it for what it is. Not a personal failure, a systemic condition, not your fault. A consequence of policy decisions, market forces, and institutional failures that are beyond your control, but whose effects are entirely within your experience. You are not imagining it. You are not being dramatic. You are not weak. You are living through a quiet collapse that is being measured by statistics that say everything is fine, while your kitchen table tells a different story. Trust your kitchen table. It knows more than the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and act on what it tells you before the quiet collapse gets louder. Because it will get louder. The labor market data that was revised downward will eventually be acknowledged. The small business closures that nobody is counting will eventually be counted. The child care centers that are closing will eventually produce a workforce participation decline that shows up in the employment statistics. And the credit card delinquencies that are climbing will eventually produce defaults that show up in the banking data. Every quiet indicator eventually becomes a loud indicator. And the transition from quiet to loud is what produces the headline, the market correction. The emergency policy response that should have been implemented 6 months earlier. You are living in the 6 months earlier right now. The quiet period, the window between the reality and the recognition. Use the window. Prepare, protect. And refuse to accept the narrative that everything is fine while your kitchen table says otherwise. Because your kitchen table is not lying. And the statistics that say otherwise are measuring an economy that no longer exists for the majority of American families. Share this video with every family that is feeling something they cannot name, because naming it is the first step to surviving it. Subscribe and turn on notifications. I am going to keep covering the quiet collapse in real time, tracking the data that the headlines ignore, the closures that nobody counts, the pressures that nobody measures, and the human cost that no statistic captures. No spin, no agenda, just the truth about what is happening beneath the surface and what you can do about it. Take care of yourselves out there. Trust your kitchen table.